What do you think about Mazzucato's entrepreneurial state? So do you think it's a viable method of achieving growth in society?
No, I don't. I think this is a dead end. I understand why she's popular with politicians and governments because they are the heroes of her story. She's telling them that, look, you can identify the sectors and the businesses and just hand them lots of money and guide them to the future, create moonshots in every sphere. Sounds wonderful. I think it underestimates how difficult innovation is. It's as if innovation can just, there's a big innovation button, but businesses don't press it sufficiently often, so let's just push it more often. I think that's a complete misunderstanding of how innovation works. If you look at successful business models, they become successful because they fail and they learn from that failure, trial and error, experiments, and constant feedback from the markets, from users, from investors, and adaptation, and eventually find something that you can scale up. Now, if you're inspired by Mazzucato, what you do is you identify, we need batteries for electric vehicles in Europe. So let's invest $15 billion in a battery factory in Skellefteå in northern Sweden. That's what we did, Northvolt. They had $15 billion and they had lots of orders from car manufacturers, couldn't fail. The problem was, since they got those resources from governments in Canada and Poland and Germany and so on, they also needed to build factories in Canada and Germany and Poland and so on. And they had to do fashionable things, so they invested in AI. They needed a lithium refinery because they had to own the entire supply chain. And they invested in new forms of battery for aviation, for wood-based batteries, because that sounded environmentally friendly, right? So they did everything except one tiny detail. And that's producing batteries for electric vehicles in that factory in northern Sweden. They never got around to creating a successful factory to produce those batteries on time. Wow. So they have now collapsed disastrously after having wasted $15 billion. And that tells me it's not a lack of political motivation and goals or taxpayer money or needs or anything. It's a lack of this insight that you don't start with $15 billion. You start small scale with entrepreneurs who try things out and constantly learn and discover how to do things. And then eventually you succeed. And then you scale that up. The Mazzucato model, I think, is a way of trying to have governments picking winners. But governments are bad at picking winners, but the losers are very good at picking governments. And they know how to tailor-make their business model and their memos to sound fashionable and great, but then they lose sight on the real business model that they should invest in.
Well, you're exactly right. It's sort of a technocratic fallacy where they think the governments can pick the winners, but one of the things that they overlook is that 99% of new businesses fail.
Yeah.
And that's exactly right, that entrepreneurs have to try and adapt, and they try different ways until one succeeds. And I think
and that means not even the entrepreneurs have any idea what will succeed in the future. So, and they are in touch with the market constantly, and they risk their own money. Whereas, so why, if they fail most of the time, why would politicians who don't have that access to constant market signals and do not risk their own money, but have other motivations? They want to win the next election, they want to do fashionable stuff and so on. How could they see a future that even entrepreneurs and scientists can't?
You're exactly right. And the other thing, they don't know the resources that are available. For, the OPEC oil crisis, that they put an oil tanker in their garden, and then overnight there was the OPEC crash, and then the oil was insanely expensive.
Right.
So that even people who are risking their own money, they can't know what's going to happen tomorrow. They don't know all the resources, even though they do have that access to the price information. And do you think it's the government's role to incentivize entrepreneurship, or is that something that they should just leave and deregulate? If you understand what I'm trying to say, that entrepreneurs are so important in society, in the capitalist process.
Yeah.
But then people think, the government should do something to help them or incentivize them.
Do you know the old ancient philosopher Diogenes lived in a sort of a shack somewhere? The story is that he's a very sort of stoic-minded and wasn't interested in material possessions or anything. Didn't take a bath, apparently. And it said that Alexander the Great visited him because he was so impressed. And he was standing there, "Oh, you're a fascinating philosopher. What can I do for you? What's the best thing that I can do?" And he said, "Step away. You're blocking the sun." That's what I want. And that's what I think that entrepreneurs should say. Yes, entrepreneurship is tremendously important. And that's why governments should step away from the sun. They should step away from trying to come up with particular incentives that guide them towards a particular way of doing things or a particular sector, because the politicians don't know that better than the billions and billions of people who are acting with their local knowledge and individual creativity. The best incentive then is to don't punish them by standing in the way of the sun and of potential revenue, capital markets, openness. So deregulation and tax cuts, that's the best thing politicians can do.
Yes, and it's one of those things where businesses are spending so much time on the paperwork and on the licenses to run their business, like licenses for florists, for example. It's absolutely insane. And they're spending so much money on the bureaucracy, on the paperwork, and they're not on the actual business.
Yeah.
And it's quite incredible to think that people are becoming bureaucrats in themselves rather than entrepreneurs.
You know, it's difficult enough in itself to create a business model that actually works. But if you also have all those requirements and regulations, it's like a small business owner I met in Sweden recently who had started a new cafe in a nice location. And he just told me, you know what, if I had known how tricky and difficult it is to get all of this through bureaucracy, I would never have done this. So I'm glad I was ignorant about all of that. I mean, because he wasn't as good at making coffee and painting furniture. He's not good at handling like those piles of documents and relationships with bureaucrats all the time.
Yeah. The important thing is the relationships with your community. That you don't get people, you sort of get soulless change rather than, and there's nothing wrong with change, but when you have entrepreneurs that know their community, that are there and then they can service a product, they don't need a big paper on the wall to say that they can pour a cup of coffee for somebody or tie a flower bouquet in a bow.
Exactly.
Well, Johan, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say, or book, or you'd like to mention?
I might then say that I've actually just written a new book about these things, but from a historical perspective. So it's called Peak Human, what we can learn from the rise and fall of golden ages. So it's looking at different cultures and civilizations from ancient Athens and onwards. What made them flourish? How was it that we suddenly got this explosion of creativity and economic growth in lots of places? And why did they eventually decline? And most importantly, what can we learn from that to make sure that our own golden age doesn't end?
That's so interesting, because one of the things you mentioned in the mirage of Swedish socialism was that Sweden was able to withstand so many of the negative effects of their socialist inclined economy because they had the long-standing preconditions from their huge period of liberalisation that allowed them to survive it. So it's one of the reasons why the cradle of society of humankind in the Iran-Iraq area, that it's not the centre of civilization today, because there are places like the UK, like Sweden, the US, where they've instituted the rule of law, deregulation, free societies that have actually been able to withstand that much longer.
I agree. You know, those important values like sort of taking responsibility and educating yourself, you want to work, you don't want to live on welfare and so on. They don't just come from nowhere. They're dependent on certain institutions that encourage those traits. And they can be around for quite a long time, even though incentives and institutions change. But after a while, they start to decline, and they have to be regenerated by having the right kind of incentives. And that's an important lesson from history.
That's perfect. That's a great note to end on. Johan Norberg, thank you very much.
Thank you.